Welcome to Wine Country at Work. I'm Ralph DeAmicis, your host. This is where we talk about the world of wine tourism and the world of wine making that makes it possible. Now, this week we're going to have our commentary at the beginning, and then after that we'll have an interview with one of our colleagues from the industry. And following, we'll have our weekly lunar wine tasting report to help you, those of us who work in tasting rooms or in the wine industry, have an idea of what's coming up for us. Now, in terms of my commentary, sometimes I do stuff about the news, but this week I want to talk about a project I'm working on because it affects a lot of us. And I had recently put an application in for a grant for a documentary I'm working on. And you may, if you listen a lot, you realize that we do this also as a television show. We've been doing that since 2012, called Wine Country at Work. And if you just go to YouTube and type in Wine Country at Work, we'll show up. And there's actually on there the little blip, the little 4-minute video from this proposal. And it's about a documentary about the healing spas of the region, going back to the 1800s. And it's really an amazing part of history because most people don't realize that back in the 1800s, this was the destination. This was the place that people wanted to go. And they would come up from San Francisco and they'd go to the spas. Now, for many years, primarily, they'd go to the spas in Napa. Why? Instead, why didn't they come to Sonoma? That doesn't seem fair. Well, in the 1800s, it was really hard to get to Sonoma because people traveled by stagecoach. And if you haven't noticed, there's a big inlet called the Golden Gate between us and San Francisco. But Napa has a river. So people would come up on the ferry boats to Napa, to downtown Napa, and then they would take stagecoaches up to the hot springs. Okay, and this is one of the ways in which Napa and Sonoma are different. Napa has hot springs all over the valley. Wherever you go, there's hot springs. There were almost 80 spas there back in the 1800s, right? Sonoma, they're concentrated in two areas. One just north of the little town of Sonoma, with Agua Caliente and Boys Hot Springs, and then much, much further north in the area that's called the Geysers. And this area around Geyserville, that area, it's very, very active. And there's actually a hot water plant that produces electricity from the geysers in that area that provides a major portion of the electricity that's used in the North Bay. Many people don't realize that we have a very, very clean form of electricity in this area, which is kind of one more reason that we're special, I guess. So as a result, for people coming up, it was much more convenient to come up on the water and, to downtown Napa, take a stagecoach up. They'd go up to Soda Springs, Jackson Soda Springs, which, was a short ride up, or they could take them further up the valley. And then they built a railroad in 9 months to take people all the way up to Calistoga because Sam Brannan, the infamous or famous Sam Brannan, depending upon your point of view, was building his resort up in that area. Why did it develop later in Sonoma? Because Sonoma was hard to reach. But when the automobile was invented and became popular, it became much more popular and easier to come to Sonoma. You could come from the city, take a ferry across the Golden Gate, bring your car up and drive up to Sonoma. And that, if you see, that's like the early 1900s. 1920, 1930, that's when it really took off here. And for instance, the Sonoma Mission Inn was built about that time. Agua Caliente, Boys Hot Springs, this was a big resort area. At that time, the Sonoma Plaza, which is the center now, that was kind of a little backwater. In fact, half of that was filled with Chinese families who had their stores there. Later on, when the spa started to break down, so to speak, or they started receding in Agua Caliente and Boys Hot Springs, people moved down onto the plaza and they actually forced the Chinese families out, which is just part of the history of this area. But that's why Sonoma developed later. It was the automobile. And now the whole industry, to a certain extent, was hurt in the 1960s when highways were developed and people could go other places more easily. But in the 1800s especially, thousands of people would come every single summer to the springs. And these are, mineral springs. This is a major healing center. Now, part of the reason was simply that there was hot water, as much hot water as you wanted. Remember, if you're living in San Francisco, and you want to take a bath, how do you do that? You get firewood and you get a big pot and you boil water and you fill the tub again and again and again. And a horrible kind of thing about our past is that in areas that were cold, the way they would use the water is that the father would take the bath first, and then using the same water, add some more hot to it, the mother would take their bath then. Though if there were older sons, the older sons would take the bath after the father, before any of the women, and then the mom, and then the daughters going down in age. And so finally the baby was the one bathed last. And this is where the old expression is, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the bathwater was so dirty. If it was a little baby, how could you tell if they were even in there? Really? As we get into our hot showers these days, and we say, think so lightly of it. Imagine back in the day what people had to go through to get clean. So living, especially in San Francisco, a very cool town, being able to come up to the North Bay, where there was endless amounts of hot water and you could soak in it all day long, was an amazing luxury. And remember too, since ancient times, these springs were considered important. They were considered healing centers. And if you go back into the most ancient times, anytime you go to a cathedral in Europe, if you will go down to the sub-basements, you will find a spring down there. All of these sacred sites started off as healing springs. These were healing centers. People would come to them for healing, and then they would plant herbs around them, healing herbs around them, because of the water content, the high mineral content. The plants were especially healing. And then they would, create circles and use it for rituals as well. And then eventually they built buildings to protect people from the weather. And these were the ancient temples to the goddesses many times. And then later on, when the Catholic Church became powerful, they built their churches on the same site, and they put the springs way underground. And they only used the water for the holy water. The healing part of the process was no longer part of it. And the reason was they wanted people looking up to the sky, which is why cathedrals were built so high. They didn't want them looking to the earth for salvation, to the healing springs. They blocked people away from them. But throughout Europe, especially in Italy, there's a lot of different spas. They're typically up in the hills where there was no way you were going to build a cathedral there. But so when they came to the United States, and they found healing springs in this area, it was a very big thing. I remember Sam Brannan always saying that, this was going to be the Saratoga Springs of California, and that became the Calistoga of Saratoga after a drunken night of too much brandy, I guess, during his sales pitches. This was a very important destination. And because it was such a healthy place, it attracted healers. So for instance, everyone knows Kellogg cereal. Well, people don't realize that Kellogg started off as a big health spa in the Midwest. And their cereals developed as foods they developed on site for the people who came there. And then they started marketing these cereals to other people. They started as a healing center. And they actually started a healing center in Napa. A group of them came out and started a healing center in Napa. And I believe that's the site of the St. Helena Hospital. Now, the state hospital is there, as there is a state hospital in Sonoma, and they were put in these areas because these areas were considered to be so healthy. The Veterans Home is in Napa because the biggest naval base in the state was in Mare Island. And so all these admirals would come up to Napa and to Sonoma to relax. And so when they wanted to build their Veterans Home, and this is the only Veterans Home built by veterans, not by the government, they decided to put it in the healthiest spot in Napa. Now, they were going to put it up on the mountains, up on Atlas Peak, because it was also believed that altitude was healthy. But they put it down on the valley floor. And there were spas like this all over where physicians would come out and they would establish spas where people could come and heal. Now, in Sonoma, of course, it was typically towards the south, and it really developed, as I mentioned, once the cars could come up here. But it was very much the same kind of thing. And what's interesting is that this area has been home to some pretty important celebrities. And if you look to see where they lived, it was all near springs. Jack London's home, his beauty ranch up on the hills where, around now where the Benziger winery is, was just up the hill from a whole series of springs. There's still a little swim club right there that uses mineral water. Now, the other in Napa, at the time, the Taylor Swift of the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s was a woman named Lily Langtry. She was born on the Isle of Jersey, and she traveled the world pretty much from California to throughout Europe, singing and performing. She was the lover of the King of Bulgaria. She was the lover of the Prince of Wales, obviously very, very famous. And she established, I believe, a 2,000 or 4,000 acre ranch up in the hills in Pope Valley, right? And this was her recluse. This was her refuge from the world. She was right down the road, or actually right up the road, from one of the most famous springs in Napa, Etna Springs, one that became very, very famous with Hollywood. And the reason was the man who started its daughter, she was like the black sheep of the family, and he pretty much disowned her. And she left and went to Hollywood and became a very famous screenwriter. Very, very successful. Well, suddenly his beloved daughter knows all these Hollywood people, and he got her to convince people to come up to Etna Springs. That made it very famous. In fact, the buildings are still there. There's actually an effort going on now to bring it back to life. Very much in the South. I mentioned Jackson Soda Springs. That was bought by Restoration Hardware. Large site, and they want to bring it back. Now, that's a particularly interesting property because it's just a short distance from the downtown. So you see, people would come up in their sailboats, and they would moor right in downtown Napa, and they'd take stagecoaches up to the springs. And it was fun because they would go through the ranch of a very famous Civil War officer. They would always stop there at the caretaker's property and have coffee with him. And then there was a waterfall up there a little further on that they would see the waterfall as they were going up. What they didn't realize was that the waterfall didn't run all the time. It was a reservoir. So whenever they knew people were coming, they would tell them in advance, and they'd turn the waterfall back on. They'd open it up so they could see the waterfall. And when they got on the property, every single one of the properties had different buildings. There were all these different buildings. So it was really, really unique, including one with a crystal dome that you could see from San Francisco, like a beacon of hope, about the potential of health and warmth and sunshine that you would experience in the North Bay, right? There were 7 springs there, and they were each one different. There was one that was known to taste like lemons, to smell and taste like lemons. So these were very, very fancy places. And then later on, Sonoma, like I said, adopted this as well. Now, Southern Sonoma really kind of took a hit on this because after the 1906 earthquake, those springs started to recede. But even though they receded in the ground, doesn't mean you couldn't access them. So if you could drill down, and so I believe the Sonoma Mission Inn, started in, I believe, 1920. They drilled down so they could access the water. One of the most famous springs in Calistoga, the Indian Springs, was part of the Sam Brandon's original estate. And the woman who ran that for many years, she had been married to a man who wanted to start the resort. They started the resort. He needed money, so they went to New York City to get the money. She was only 18 years old, had never left wine country, had never left this region. They get there, he gets the money, and he drops dead. And she comes back with all this money and her husband's body, but she decided to go on, and she ran it for the next 30 or 40 years very successfully. And she drilled down until she had 3 geysers. Now, up in that area, they're actually expanding that spa. As we become more and more concerned with our health going into the future and want more and more natural methods, we should really look at these springs and these resorts and these spas as a way to develop a very healthy form of tourism. Now, you've heard me say before that wine is the original health drink, and it really is. But we really need to look at these other resources as well. And something I have seen is that a lot of the groups that are coming here, that are going up into the hills to the various different resorts, are coming here for wellness programs. This was always considered the healthiest part of the state for really good reasons. So we need to look at that as we're going forward into the future, don't you think? I mean, why not? Bring people good things. They always appreciate that. If you come up with products and services that truly benefit your customers, you always do well. So after this, we're going to have an interview with one of our colleagues, and then after that, we're going to have the weekly Lunar Wine Tasting Report. So make sure you stay around for that, and I'll let you know how we're doing with this documentary. Like I said, you can go onto YouTube and look at Wine Country at Work, and you'll see a lot of our different shows that we've done since 2012, where we've gone all over this region and talked with people about what a wonderful place it is. So once again, Wine Country at Work, I'm Ralph DeAmicis, and we'll be right back after this break.